Thank you so much for joining us for this fourth session on this webinar series on a very important topic, carbon pricing. Those of you who have joined us in the previous three sessions will know that this series was jointly curated with Andre Marco, a prominent figure in the field of climate change and energy policy, who has made significant contributions to shaping climate and energy policies in Europe as the founder and executive director of the European Roundtable on Climate Change and Sustainable Transition. So we have had leading speakers contribute to three important topics: the concept of pricing carbon and valuing it, mandatory carbon markets, voluntary carbon markets, and today we want to unpack what we have heard and how this can be applied to Malaysia. So we recognize that carbon pricing is considered critical today for several reasons, especially if we fully understand how urgent it is to take action, to decarbonize, to adapt. This is one means of correcting the classic market failure where polluters profit and society bears the cost of emissions. So what would be an economically efficient, market-based approach to reduce emissions and possibly generate revenue for the government, which, if allocated judiciously, could also aid in a smooth and just transition? So we want to carefully consider the design elements and means of implementing carbon pricing policies to ensure their effectiveness and fairness, including addressing the potential impacts on vulnerable populations, preventing carbon leakage, and ensuring a just transition for affected industries and communities. So we've got three great speakers with us today, all three of whom are really great friends. We are going to start hearing from Dr. Gary Theseira, who is also a council member of Climate Governance Malaysia. And then we're going to hear an overview as well from Darshan Joshi, who is a climate consultant at the World Bank. And finally, and by no means least important, Dr. Alizan Mahadi, Senior Director at the Institute of Strategic and International Studies, who is going to share his thoughts as well on the policy recommendations that the government should be thinking of. So if I can invite Dr. Gary Theseira to kick off with his presentation and sharing his thoughts. Over to you, Gary.
Thank you very much, Sunita, and may I say that it is a pleasure to be able to speak at this event after having moderated the last three sessions and benefiting greatly from doing so. Very well, let me begin with my slides. Hopefully they're all visible. Okay, those of you who are looking at this will probably recognize it as the Southeast Asian region, particularly Malaysia, seen from space, which tells us exactly where the large amounts of fossil fuels are actually being converted into light energy, and it becomes very apparent when we look at it this way. It also shows us which areas are not emitting and therefore being put to some other land use that could be quite interesting. So as far as my outline goes, I'm going to talk a little bit about the choice of instruments that the various speakers have mentioned throughout these three initial sessions, what kinds of parameters need to be set when we're thinking about these instruments, and then how these instruments need to reside within an enabling environment. I don't think there's any of the individual speakers who has ever mentioned that any of these instruments by themselves can actually bring about the kind of very holistic change that we need. In fact, all of them have very clearly said that we need change everywhere all at once. And then what I'll try to do is try to link this with the circular economy, because I think that as we implement and look at the ways in which we implement circular economy, there are lots of things that actually do support the pricing of carbon and the reduction of emissions, and then a quick conclusion. All right, so most of all, drawing from everything that's been said in the last three sessions, Of course, the carbon tax is one of the instruments that's been mentioned a fair bit. Of course, we all know that Singapore has implemented it, and Indonesia is thinking very strongly about it. The good thing about the carbon tax is it does give a lot of certainty to the pricing of carbon, but it doesn't fix it, because this can be progressive, it can increase with time, and all this can be laid out in a schedule that allows businesses as well as investors to understand how this is going to be implemented. A second oft mentioned scheme is, of course, the emissions trading scheme. You also hear it being called a cap and trade scheme. This actually puts a certainty on the cap or the amount of emissions or emissions reductions that you are going to be seeking, but it allows the market to find its own price. Now, listening over the course of the three presentations, we found that price discovery is a very, very important feature of this instrument. And there are a lot of things that can go wrong in terms of price discovery, particularly if there are market distortions arising from things like subsidies, which can actually put pressure on actually finding a true price. So if we have subsidies, or if we have any kinds of carve-outs, it's going to be very, very difficult to actually help the market to find a true price. Another thing which plays a role is the size itself of the market. We've heard many times that when markets are not appropriately sized, or if they are inadequate in terms of their size and the number of players involved. Andre even mentioned the Kyoto Protocol as the first example of too few players in a market, and in some ways prevented price discovery that the emissions trading scheme may not be the best tool. Now, aside from these two, and by the way, these aren't if decisions. You could have a carbon tax on one sector and an emissions trading scheme on other sectors, for example. So it can be a mix and match system if you so choose. Well, together with the carbon tax and emissions trading scheme, you have crediting mechanisms, and one of these that we're currently practicing in Malaysia is the renewable energy credits, or RECs. All right, so these things can and often do exist concurrently, and sometimes they can provide credits to the markets, for example, depending on how you choose to implement this. In any case, you do need to have independent verifiers to ensure that the emissions reductions are valid and meet all the requirements. Another instrument that is similar, but instead delivers the funds when the entities meet, achieve, or maintain specific climate-related goals is this results-based payment. And you will find that RED Plus in the forestry sector is one example of such a framework. All right. And then finally, there is what is also already going on in both of its forms. When we're talking about internal carbon pricing, normally we're referring to one or another of either shadow pricing, which is already being done by several major corporations, including Petronas and TNB, and internal carbon charges, where within a company itself, within perhaps its supply chain, perhaps in its subsidiaries, it actually charges a price for carbon. Now, as I said, it's very important to recognize that these things can all exist simultaneously depending on how you structure the international, how you structure your national framework, and they can generally be mutually supportive depending on the strengths and the weaknesses of these different sectors. All right. What's also been mentioned a lot, besides talking about the instruments, is the parameters that need to be set. For example, if you want to have a subnational market, then you might need to cluster certain categories of sectors to have a critical mass that you need. Otherwise, you can have a national system, but even at that national level, you might find that the size of the market might be inadequate. All right? So you can once again split or combine clumpers and splitters, and you may also introduce a kind of progression in here as well, where you might progressively clump more and more clusters or groups of sectors together. The other thing that we need to talk about is emissions thresholds. First thing we talk about is an entry threshold, which level do you fall into a program. Probably there are many small emitters that emit such small amounts of greenhouse gases that they may not fall into the categories. And Singapore is an example. With their tax, they do have a threshold which you have to surpass to drop into the group of entities that's going to be taxed. Carbon pricing is another thing. If you have a tax, then you normally begin with a fairly low tax. Singapore began at 5 Singapore dollars. Indonesia is talking about 30 rupiah per ton, and this can progress with time. This can be, and when this is transparent, then it allows companies, it allows investors to understand very clearly the impact on the economy. And then the idea that you do need at some point in time to align yourself to global goals, to national goals and targets, and perhaps the onset of certain regulations or legislation that you may be planning. So all these things become part and parcel of the parameter set that you will need to implement this successfully. Next, I think every single one of the speakers also in the last 3 sessions has talked about the fact that, first of all, no one instrument or methodology is going to solve, or technology is going to solve all these problems. That is going to actually have to take, once again, all of society approach, and it's going to require an enabling environment, which once again begins with some kind of rationalization of subsidies. And this, like I said, includes any kinds of freebies, it includes any kinds of entitlements, carve-outs. There can't be any sacred cows. If you look at Singapore's tax, it does cover indeed all sectors, but like I said, there is a threshold at which you will find yourself under this particular regulation. But if there are any subsidies in any of the sectors, then the distortion that it introduces can actually counteract carbon pricing efforts. Now, when we think of incentives, many times we think of financial incentives, but there are many other kinds of incentives that we can have. You can have, of course, low-cost financing. The Gita is a strong example, continues to be a very strong example in Malaysia of how things can work. But these can also take the form of allowances for human capital enhancement and training as well. So, for example, we can have, we definitely will need strengthening our human capital, deepening the expertise in quantification, in measurement, reporting, verification, auditing, certification, all of these things. I think these are really key areas. And then finally, putting together an implementation framework that ensures that stakeholders are informed very, very early, that stakeholders are engaged, that their views are collected and recorded and made part of the decision-making process. And then also the importance of having clear guidelines, compliance monitoring, and then very, very clear enforcement mechanisms. All right. Now, once again, as I mentioned, how to describe this enabling environment. One of the ways that I see that we can actually deliver it is to implement together with this circular economy. If we look at it during the design phase, we can actually ensure that product over its lifetime has as few emissions as possible. It lasts as long as possible so that you don't have to keep making new products and generating new emissions. Many automakers in Germany and even Korea now already are planning ahead of time how all these vehicles are going to be recycled. We've had a study that shows that greenhouse gas emissions in a circular economy can be reduced by 70% and at the same time contribute to reducing the income gap. Right? When we think about this, if we are able to ensure that products are more durable, we can be reused, can be repaired, upgraded, rebuilt, then what we will do is we will eliminate the excess consumption and find the true level for the greenhouse gas emissions. Until and unless we find the true consumption levels, the price is going to be distorted. Planning obsolescence is planning emissions. So we should try to design that out so we can design out these planned emissions. Extended producer responsibility is another area that more and more companies are willing to get into because they see this as a way of actually taking pressure off of some of their scope 3 emissions. This image is Schiphol Airport, where more and more companies are providing products in the form of a service. So, if we don't need to own as many things, many times this calls for, it can allow for a reduction in the level of production and the level of emissions. And then thinking about moving from ownership to stewardship, moving from consumers to users of durable products, creators of durable products. And once again, the idea that as we have more skilled people who will ensure the longevity of these products, that we can actually have higher paying jobs compared to the lower paying jobs of disposable items, the low paying jobs of managing waste items, and instead have jobs that actually involve semi-skilled and skilled individuals who are capable of upcycling, refurbishing, rebuilding, repairing, and these sorts of activities. And finally, as part of this ecosystem, it does require a network. Now, going back once again, if we can deliver these, of course, Datin already mentioned the polluter pays principle. Once again, if we get moved to this skilled and semi-skilled workforce, it will facilitate this just transition. We also need to remember that carbon pricing is not a standalone mechanism. It has to exist with and mutually support other kinds of policy goals, both climate and non-climate. And this, I mean, the Sustainable Development Goals, all 17 of them, besides just SDG number 13. For this to work, also, I think all the speakers have been very, very clear that the policy framework that is implemented must send signals that are clear, consistent, and increasing in intensity, both for the businesses and the investors, that in line with what's happening with the ISSB and transparency and disclosure requirements, there's increased transparency. And then what should happen is that as has already been announced, the energy efficiency and conservation bill, part of what's necessary to actually discover true cost and therefore discover the true price of carbon. All right, thank you very, very much. The last one goes without saying, environmental integrity, and these should actually be measurable vis-a-vis the Sustainable Development Goals. Thank you very much.
Gary, I love the fresh insights that you're bringing, especially circularity, right? And that prices will be distorted until we find true consumption levels. I love that. Thank you so much, Gary. Can we now invite Darshan to share his thoughts with us today? Thank you, Darshan.
All right. Thank you again to Climate Governance Malaysia, to Datin Sunita, Dr. Gary, for having me here to speak today. In my presentation, I will cover 3 agenda items. First, I will cover a primer of sorts on climate economics. Second, I'll go through a review of climate economic instruments that have been implemented in Malaysia. And finally, I'll close with a look into carbon pricing initiatives across ASEAN. So we'll begin with the climate economics primer and the economic perspective on climate change. in which climate change is no more than a series of market failures. So the first of these market failure, and it's the market failure that's mentioned in the title of this webinar series, this is the negative externality. And in the context of carbon pricing, the negative externality in question are greenhouse gas emissions. But this can also extend to broader pollution, let's say air pollution or water pollution. And in the absence of any mechanisms which price such pollution, price carbon or price just pollution in general, we're likely to see an oversupply or overabundance of these externalities. And in the context of climate change, we see that because it's the rise in emissions, which is causing an increase in the atmospheric concentration of carbon that is driving climate change. Now, there are many potential policy responses to the negative externality, one of which is what we're talking about today, carbon pricing. But over the years, we've also seen many examples of, most prominently, transport fuel taxes, which are sort of an indirect carbon pricing instrument. But the negative externality is only the first of many market failures that are contributing to climate change. Another key market failure in this regard is incomplete information. And this extends to things like a lack of economic valuations for environmental goods. For example, what are forests worth, or what is clean air worth, for example. And if we don't have accurate valuations of these products, it's tough then to sort of build the business case to conserve or to protect the environment ahead of practices that might be more exploitative, but may generate higher revenues. A third example of a market failure associated with climate change is public goods. And the most prominent of these examples, and related to the greenhouse gas emissions negative externality, is the global atmosphere. There is no price associated with contributing to the carbon concentration in the atmosphere. So where there is no price, again, the atmosphere is going to be overused. And this is what we see playing out with the consequences of climate change. Clean air and water are also public goods in this regard, as are natural capitals such as forests, since they have the potential to sequester carbon and thus contribute to the mitigation of climate change. Another major market failure is suboptimal resource allocation, and this manifests itself in many ways. One of which is the underinvestment that we have seen historically in the sort of technologies that would be good for us in terms of mitigating climate change. Resources are also suboptimally allocated when we subsidize things like fossil fuels, which contribute to the worsening of climate change, mispricing of resources such as water or even electricity. And another perhaps more controversial take on suboptimal resource allocation is our practice of discounting the future. And for a long time, this has been something that has prevented us from acting towards addressing climate change. The important thing is that there are many policy responses to help us address each of these market failures. And in doing so, we can build a sort of holistic approach towards addressing the problem. Next, I'll just introduce a term, climate economic instruments. So ultimately, the aim of our climate policy should be to stimulate behavioral changes that are going to lead to reductions in emissions. And typically, these instruments can either be mitigation focused, so seeking to achieve emissions reductions at the lowest possible cost. And there are also adaptation instruments, which are catered more directly towards enhancing our resilience to the impacts of climate change. And finally, there are instruments that have co-benefits, so they'll have implications for mitigation and adaptation, such as forest conservation, for example, which can also have impacts on the protection of biodiversity and other good things. Climate economic instruments typically stimulate behavioral changes by influencing monetary incentives. So they do this by, let's say, affecting costs or prices, or enabling finance, or ensuring returns for low carbon investments, for example. And then I'm going to quickly introduce a distinction between economic instruments. So some of them directly correct for market failures. Carbon pricing, in putting a price on the negative externality, directly targets the market failure. But there's another band of instruments which are perhaps more politically feasible, but are more narrower in terms of their objectives. And this can be things like incentives to stimulate low carbon energy, for example. So tech-based fiscal incentives. We'll move into now the Malaysia Climate Economic Instrument Review, and on the table on the left is a list of all the climate economic instruments that have been introduced. Well, if we ignore the transfer of fuel subsidies, everything that's been introduced since the passage of the National Policy on Climate Change in 2009. And immediately, if you look at the second column, you can see that historically, a lot of these instruments are strictly defined as second best instruments. They're very targeted towards specific activities, such as renewable energy deployment and energy efficiency measures. Where carbon pricing is different is that it is the first best, potentially first best instrument. It will target the externality directly. And this really signals a change in pace towards addressing climate change, at least in the domestic context. If we look at the adaptation instruments, we see a similar picture where previously a lot of our sort of adaptation instruments have been aid or relief efforts, typically in response to things that have happened. And again, in the 12th Malaysia Plan, it was introduced that there would be an expansion to ecological fiscal transfers, payments for ecosystem services, and these also would act as first best instruments as they directly target the market failures that are, in this case, leading to an undersupply of conservation efforts. And in Malaysia, with the National Adaptation Plan currently in development, this should really consolidate all the various adaptation efforts moving forward. Finally, I'll spend a bit more time looking into carbon pricing initiatives that are ongoing across ASEAN at present. So first, I'll start with a review of the select key climate targets across the region. In this table, we're focusing on Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, and Vietnam. All the countries have submitted enhanced nationally determined contributions over the last 2 to 3 years to the UNFCCC. Malaysia is the only country in ASEAN that has set its NDC in terms of the GHG intensity of GDP. All the other countries in ASEAN have set targets that are either relative to BAU or relative to a baseline, with the exception of Singapore, who have set an absolute emissions target. And on the column on the right, you'll see that there is a wide range in the key low carbon target indicators that have been employed by ASEAN members. All ASEAN members have set net zero targets for either 2050, 2060, or 2065, with the exception of the Philippines. But it has to be said that the Philippines has set a target to peak its emissions by 2030. Beyond that, a lot of the common targets you'll see across ASEAN are to do with renewable energy capacity. Next, we'll look at carbon pricing instruments around Southeast Asia. So at present, the countries that have implemented a carbon pricing instrument, or CPI, are Singapore, which implemented a carbon tax back in 2019, and Indonesia, whose emissions trading scheme for coal-fired power plants commenced earlier this year. Efforts to, or at least in Brunei, in Malaysia, in Philippines, and Vietnam, carbon pricing instruments are being considered, although there's no specific dates that have been set for their implementation. And the only 3 countries in ASEAN that are currently not considering the implementation of either a tax or an ETS are Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar. I've also included carbon crediting mechanisms in this table, and in most cases, this refers to crediting activities that have occurred under the Clean Development Mechanism, as well as the RED Plus framework. And all ASEAN members have, over the years, been involved in carbon credit activities. A number of ASEAN members also have implemented indirect carbon pricing instruments. So this includes, as I mentioned in the notes here, fossil fuel taxes or environmental taxes. In Indonesia, Laos, Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, and Vietnam, they all have indirect carbon pricing instruments in place. And then finally, Dr. Gary mentioned this earlier on as well, and no assessment of carbon pricing instruments would be complete without an assessment of fossil fuel subsidies, which essentially counteract carbon pricing instruments. They subsidize the very thing that carbon pricing instruments seek to tax or place a price on. These are still prevalent in Brunei, Indonesia, and Malaysia. And interestingly, these are three countries that are considering the implementation of carbon pricing instruments. So some efforts will have to be taken towards rationalizing these subsidies prior to introducing carbon pricing instruments in these countries. But all in all, it's clear that ASEAN members are moving in a similar direction. They've all a lot of the ASEAN members understand the potential benefits of carbon pricing towards meeting emissions reduction targets and are all trending in a similar direction at a similar time. Okay, finally, we'll do a quick deep dive into three countries that are implementing or have implemented carbon pricing instruments. The first we'll look at is Indonesia. Indonesia has, over the years, developed a very extensive regulatory framework towards implementing a carbon pricing instrument. So their journey started in 2017, really, with a regulation on the use of environmental economic instruments. And in this regulation, they mandated the creation of either an emissions trading scheme or a waste permit trading system by 2024. Fast forward to 2021, and Indonesia put forward a regulation that provided a framework for carbon pricing instruments and the roles that these carbon pricing instruments could play towards meeting greenhouse gas targets. There was also an additional regulation on the harmonization of tax regulation. And in this regulation, they introduced plans to introduce a carbon tax. In October 2022, guidelines were issued for carbon pricing implementation and providing the legal basis for a cross-sectoral ETS. It also provided guidance on carbon trading, on the institutional landscape, as well as MRV. And finally, in December 2022, guidelines were published specifically for CPI implementation in the power sector. And this provided the legal basis for a ETS system that covered the power sector. In February 2023, Indonesia launched an ETS for power generation. In the first phase, it only applies to the 99 state-owned coal power plants that are responsible for about 80% of Indonesia's electricity generation capacity. And there are plans in the later phases 2 and 3 to extend coverage across oil and gas and other coal power plants. Indonesia also had planned to launch a carbon tax in April 22, but that following changes in the turmoil really in energy markets has been postponed to 2025. If we look at Singapore next, Singapore has had a very supportive legislative framework and a very clearly defined implementation process. So in 2018, Singapore launched its Carbon Pricing Act, and this announced that a carbon tax would be introduced covering all high emitting facilities at a rate of 5 Singapore dollars per ton, or about $4 per ton from 2019 onwards. This tax, although simple sounding, still encompassed over 80% of Singapore's greenhouse gases. Just last year, Singapore passed an amendment to their Carbon Pricing Act, and this introduced that there will be 3 rate hikes introduced over the next 10 years until the price of carbon reaches roughly 50 Singapore dollars at least in 2028. The amendment also introduced provisions to support emissions-intensive trade-exposed firms, and as well as a provision to allow companies to use carbon credits to offset their tax liabilities under the compliance market scheme. Earlier this year, Singapore also launched its domestic carbon exchange to support institutional investors, multinational corporations in participating in carbon credit purchases. Finally, Thailand has had a long history with carbon pricing, the various forms of carbon pricing. Looking first at the compliance side, in 2017, they launched their 12th National Economic and Social Development Plan. And in this plan, they announced that they will develop economic instruments to support greenhouse gas emissions reductions. In 2022, the Excise Department announced plans for a carbon tax that would cover a number of sectors, and studies towards this end are currently ongoing. The Ministry of Natural Resources and Environment announced that more details on the the carbon pricing instruments would be introduced in the Climate Change Act that is currently in development. And the government is also developing laws to govern greenhouse gas reporting as well as emissions trading systems. And ETS and carbon tax are both currently under consideration by the Thai government. And while this has been going on, or even prior to this going on, the Thailand Greenhouse Gas Management Organization developed the Thai voluntary ETS market to support firms in achieving emissions reductions and also developing and enhancing MRV systems in the country. And through this program, participating entities can offset emissions through the domestic crediting program. And this voluntary activities also have targets set to them. So certain industrial activities are subject to targets to reduce emissions relative to their 2012 or 2013 baseline. Finally, I'll end with a few key considerations from Malaysia based on what other ASEAN members have been doing, as well as recommendations in the broader literature. So the first of this is to implement carbon pricing instruments in a progressive and clearly defined way, at least for expansion of these policies. So starting from a low carbon price and a more limited scope, for example, looking at your emissions intensive trade exposed sectors or your power sectors which generate most of your emissions, to incentivize all these sectors and all these actors to start engaging in their lowest abatement cost activities, and also to establish familiarity with the new regime, because carbon pricing will be a new policy, a new way of doing business essentially. And then following in the footsteps of Singapore would definitely help to establish a clear schedule for, let's say, price hikes under a carbon tax system or emissions cap reductions in an ETS. And it's always good to expand the scope to equalize the incentives to decarbonize across supply chains and across industries. A second key recommendation would be to ensure consistency across your climate economic instruments. So in the presence of multiple carbon pricing instruments, for example, a tax and an ETS, this becomes very important because you don't want each instrument to send different signals. And even if you are looking at only a tax or an ETS, you need to ensure that CPIs and your other climate instruments, such as your renewable energy policies, for example, send consistent signals and support each other. Finally, third, we should continue to encourage offsetting activities in the hard to abate sectors, because carbon pricing instruments are not a blanket tool to address all the various market failures that I brought up earlier on in this presentation, and to support low carbon activities in, for example, forestry and land use, coastal and marine resources. It would help to enable, under any CPI, companies to use these carbon credits to offset their tax liabilities. And this can be another way to draw further financing for low carbon activities in forestry and coastal resources. Finally, and Alizan is going to cover this in this presentation, I'm sure, but to use carbon pricing revenues to sustain broader climate efforts. And one way that this can be done is to earmark all carbon pricing instrument revenues to be used for mitigation actions, adaptation actions, as well as, importantly, just transition support for EIT industries. With that, I'll close up. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Darshan. Thank you. Great new insights, climate economic instruments. How can we navigate towards emissions reductions with the lowest cost and least friction? That carbon pricing is the first best instrument, which also calls back to the Asia Foundation report, that this is an important signal that there's a change in pace. But of course, carbon pricing needs to work hand in hand with climate change policy. Now, Dr. Alizan Mahadi, over to you. Looking forward to hearing what you have to say now.
Thank you, Sunita. And firstly, thank you to CGM for inviting me for this webinar. I think we've heard from the previous speakers and also the previous sessions on really a primer on carbon pricing in general, and also a bit from Darshan and Dr. Gary before this in the context of Malaysia. So what I will do today is I'll try to bring that conversation first looking forward into what are the recommendations for Malaysia, but really looking into from a policy perspective on what are some of the gaps and what in my view, we should be looking into for implementing a carbon pricing instrument within Malaysia. So I'll just cover three short things. Firstly, the Malaysian climate policy context for carbon pricing. Secondly, the key policy and institutional design considerations for the context of Malaysia. And finally, I'll just run through some of the policy recommendations. Okay, first of all, just a step back is to understand really why we need a carbon pricing instrument. And of course, all of you know here that the reason is because of the climate emergency. I think everyone here has heard that UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres highlighted climate change as an era of global boiling, no longer global warming. But the key thing for the purpose of my presentation is even when we do policy, there has to be a clear rationale and purpose to any instrument that we formulate. And in the context of environment and climate change, actually, many of the studies that we have previously done, the purpose is not specifically to reduce climate change, but often they are intertwined or prioritized with other purposes. And mostly understandably, there are socioeconomic targets. But really, when we want to provide a clear instrument, we really have to formulate it understanding what is that purpose. And often when you talk about carbon pricing, that purpose is fixed to a certain reduction of emissions in an absolute manner, quantitatively. So let's see the Malaysian climate policy context and understand a bit what are our some of our existing targets. Of course, as Darshan and I think Dr. Gary mentioned, we have an unconditional target to cut GHG emission intensity against GDP by 40% by 2030. We have, again, mentioned already, the long-term target of achieving net zero by as early as 2050. We have various targets, especially communicated within our energy policies. Recently, we have the National Energy Policy, which has the target of stop building new coal-fired plants and reducing coal capacity. We have various targets on renewable energy in terms of both installed capacity as well as total primary energy supply. We have targets in terms of urban public transport model share. We have targets in terms of EV. We have targets in terms of energy efficiency savings, and so on and so forth. Now, if you look into, again, designing a carbon pricing instrument of reducing emissions to a certain level, what we are still missing is an absolute target for emission reduction. And therefore, that makes designing a carbon pricing instrument a little bit harder because there is no clarity in terms of our absolute emissions reductions. And this will be even more difficult when we go to sectoral emissions reduction targets. So in terms of some of the policy tools and instruments that we have previously formulated within Malaysia, when we talk about policy tools, we can divide it into three areas. Firstly is legal, secondly is economic instruments that Darshan presented earlier, and also informational tools. In terms of legal instruments, this includes various relevant acts that regulate climate change. We do have existing acts such as the Environmental Quality Act 1974, which, for example, has its first schedule is on clean air regulations, which has some relevance to climate change. We have the Renewable Energy Act, so on and so forth. But we do not have a specific climate change act. It is currently being considered and formulated, and we do not have an act governing carbon pricing at this moment, as carbon pricing is still being under consideration. Jumping to informational tools, we do have various information tools in the form of action plans, roadmaps, and so on. For example, the National Energy Transition Roadmap, the Long-Term Low Emissions Development Strategy, which is currently being formulated. And also we have, for example, for carbon pricing, this includes the National Guidance on Voluntary Carbon Market Mechanisms. But also we have, when we talk about carbon pricing, we are talking about economic instruments. And as Darshan previously presented, we have various financial and fiscal instruments. But the rationale of these targets, going back to the purpose of why these instruments were being developed, they were mainly based on economic targets, especially most of its focus is on technology adoption as opposed to environmental targets. So often when we talk about carbon pricing instruments, when we talk about carbon tax, when we talk about carbon trade, as you have heard from the previous primers, the reason for a carbon pricing instrument is to achieve economic efficiency for a specific target. here we have not had instruments that address this, what we call first best policy, because they are mainly focused on technology adoption. And this is quite normal within developing countries, but the next step, as Darshan said, is to do a first best policy, which is to align a climate target with an economic instrument. Some of the policy challenges in the context of Malaysia, firstly, is the energy trilemma, of course, balancing sustainability by balancing the climate goals with ensuring energy security. For example, we all know the challenge of solar is intermittency to ensure stability of supply, and of course, also affordability. One major challenge is the low electricity tariffs in Malaysia. Malaysia has one of the lowest tariffs in the region, I think second lowest after Myanmar. And I think Dr. Gary already mentioned human capital and this challenge of a just transition, especially in the context of Malaysia being an oil and gas producing nation. But also a key challenge that was also highlighted before is the incentive structure, especially having the correct incentives and removing the disincentives for climate targets. Dr. Gary and Darshan already mentioned the challenge or the need to rationalize subsidies because they are essentially perverse subsidies that go against the rationale of any carbon tax or carbon pricing instrument being developed. So generally, the previous instruments, there are some design-related issues. They are limited in scope, the incentivization structure. There is no really externalization of externalities, and there are various implementation-related issues, such as there is a need for stakeholder buy-in, there's a lack of access to finance, as well as lack of funding. So I'm going to go to some of the key policy and institutional design considerations, especially in the context of Malaysia. Firstly, when we talk about CPIs, again, Dr. Gary already highlighted the list of instruments, but mainly the question is often carbon tax versus the ETS or cap and trade system. So this choice of instrument will be dependent on various factors. One of them is the point of regulation or taxation. I will come back to that. But the key, once again, consideration I have to emphasize once again here is the purpose of the instrument itself. Now, carbon tax provides price certainty, whereby cap and trade provides emissions level certainty, as Dr. Gary highlighted. But for either to work, it will have to, we will have to set either the price for carbon tax or the quantity for emissions cap. Now, this is the challenge we see, for example, with the voluntary carbon market, where without the policy landscape, without the enabling environment of setting either a certain price or a certain quantity, the market response is relatively weak. Secondly, in terms of scope or coverage, of course, here the focus should include the most emission-intensive sectors. And in the context of Malaysia, this is the energy sector, which accounts for about 80% of GHG emissions, while heavy industries are also steadily increasing. So if you see the diagram there in yellow, it is obvious that the energy sector should be the main focus. But interestingly enough, in the context of Malaysia, the green below is what you call land use and land use change and forestry, which is essentially forestry and the ability for Malaysia to offset some of these emissions. Here, the important point is the key stakeholders that will be affected are therefore energy-related companies. And these are, of course, large state-owned enterprises and landowners, which are largely state governments. So using a political economy approach, we have to understand which are the largest stakeholders to be affected and really engage these stakeholders to understand what are the issues in implementing a carbon pricing instrument. So the key recommendation here is to focus on highest emitting sectors with other sectors gradually being included. Okay, in terms of the point of regulation or taxation, carbon tax can be levied at any point in the energy supply chain. The simplest one administratively would be to levy the tax upstream. And here there are just a few entities that be subject to it. In the context of Malaysia, there's only two companies that supply either coal or gas to power plants in Malaysia. This is TNB Fuel for imported coal and Petronas Energy and Gas Trading for natural gas. Alternatively, the tax could be leveled midstream, and this is what is often done in many countries at the combustion level, especially, for example, the example given by Darshan in Indonesia. So at the midstream and generation level, the key impacted stakeholders are the power producers and TNB as the electric utility company. But this also depends whether this mechanism will be avoided or will be influenced by the imbalance cost pass-through mechanism, where the idea here is that the cost of generation can be passed down through to the consumers. So this means that in all likelihood, any CPI being implemented at the mainstream level will most likely be passed down to the consumers anyway. Now, at the downstream level, it'll be the consumers that bear the cost, and this is clear in many countries in the case of a fuel tax, especially in non-carbon trading or downstream at the point of consumption, such as in vehicles, such as through a fuel tax. So the key recommendation here is the policy design will require addressing the challenges of affordability as well as the use of revenue to ensure that vulnerable communities and sectors are protected as a pathway for a just transition. Okay, next, in terms of the use of revenues from CPI, revenues from CPIs can be used for various reasons. And I won't go through all of them in detail, but the big point here is that with those revenues, you can use them, for example, broadly to reduce public debt and deficit, for government spending, or to reduce taxes in other areas. But the key recommendation here is to address climate change. The revenues should be used for funding climate-related investments and transitional support for the most affected sectors, as opposed to broad uses such as reducing public debt and deficit and the use of revenues to reduce other taxes. Finally, in terms of schedule expansion of scope and price, the key policy and institutional design consideration here is to have a gradual approach to increase either the sectors in terms of carbon trade or the price in terms of a carbon tax. And again, this was already mentioned by Darshan. For example, in Singapore, where the current price is at 5 Singapore dollars now, it is increasing to $25 in 2024, $45 in 2026, with an ultimate aim of achieving $50 to $80 by 2030. Now, I'll just conclude with some of the policy recommendations, some of which I've already highlighted. Firstly, I cannot emphasize enough that the policy objective and rationale of any economic instrument must be tied to the rationale of reducing emissions. Once again, previous instruments that we have analyzed before, many of its rationale and purpose was tied mainly to an economic rationale, usually of technology adoption. So for an economic instrument to be more effective, it has to be tied to a quantitative target of an absolute emissions reduction. Also, things that I haven't highlighted here is there is a need for the use of revenue to support climate objectives, including for a just transition, especially this should be used to redistribute to B40 and vulnerable communities. One key element for any effective CPI would be that relevant data should be made available, especially through mandatory disclosures and reporting. Finally, we really need to understand what is the social cost of carbon in Malaysia. So this requires databases on the social cost of carbon to be created and also be made available. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Alizan. Thank you. So we can't look at carbon in isolation. We need to align priorities, for example, with the energy trilemma that we are facing, and especially as the energy sector is generating 80% of our greenhouse gas emissions. Climate policy tools are critical, and aligning targets with economic instruments. So we've listened to our three speakers now, and I think you'll agree, everyone will agree with me when I say that we've really had some excellent interventions, and I'm so grateful to you. Thank you so much. So I'm just going to, we've been responding to the questions from the audience in the chat box, but I wanted to just kick off with maybe two questions for all our speakers, and just to get their views on this. So we know that we've got rising frequency, severity of extreme weather events. We understand that any form of pricing or mandatory trading system might take 2 to 3 years to implement. How can we best in Malaysia impart a sense of urgency and ensure that large emitters decarbonize sooner rather than later? I'm going to ask this in a rapid fire question way. So carbon tax or cap and trade, and at what point of regulation and why? Can we start with Dr. Gary? Darshan, please turn on your video as well.
Okay, thank you very much, Sunita. So I think that once again, because of the issues of scale, a carbon tax is probably preferable. I think it can be modeled in some ways after our previous experiences with the previous taxes that we've tried before. So I think some of the infrastructure are already there. So I think as far as the Ministry of Finance goes, it shouldn't be too difficult to implement. As to what can accelerate it, it's a bit difficult to point at individual situations. I mean, we already have reports that the damage in the month of July, I think, in China from the 2 typhoons is already greater than the amount of environmental damage of the months of January through June, the total. And so, just in 1 month, you can have six months worth of damage. And as I've said before, the tropical depression that we had in the Klang Valley in December of 2021 was just a warning. In my view, tropical depressions can be far more severe. They can persist for much longer than the 3 to 4 days that this one did. Thank you.
Darshan, what about you? What are your thoughts?
Thanks for the question, Sunita. So I wrote down in my notes that I'm going to sit on the fence, and I'm going to say that the approach we should take is a carbon cap and tax system. So carbon taxes and emissions trading systems both have their advantages and disadvantages. I think most prominently a carbon tax offers price certainty, whereas an emissions cap offers emissions reduction certainty without any guarantees over the price. So in a carbon cap and tax system, it's one where we can align our emissions reductions goals with, for example, an NDC or the target to hit net zero emissions by 2050. And then any emitters who exceed their stipulated cap would then pay a tax on their excess emissions. So this is a way of bringing the best of the carbon tax together with the best of the ETS and coming to a combined system.
So a hybrid. Okay, a hybrid form. Alizan, what are your thoughts?
Thank you. I think I agree with Darshan, a hybrid system, but I think more importantly is it is dependent on which sector. Well, 2 things. I think most instruments are designed based on whether it is administratively feasible and the structure of the sector itself. So, for example, if you talk about the transport sector, I think I briefly mentioned just now, it is more feasible to have a fuels tax. I mean, you cannot have a trade regime. It'll be very difficult to administer a trade regime for people driving in cars. So that is also because the structure there, it consists of large number of entities that you will have to trade with. On the other hand, for example, at the midstream level of energy production, there's only quite a few entities, and it's more feasible for you to have a cap and trade system. So I think moving forward, it is more likely to be hybrid. For power generation, both are okay, actually, in my view, carbon tax or cap and trade. But we have seen administratively this is possible, for example, in Indonesia and many other countries. So I think a cap and trade there is feasible, politically feasible as well, because people hate taxes. But for more downstream sectors or downstream users, such as transportation, it will be more feasible to have a carbon tax.
I think that's a good place for us to land, whether it's upstream with the emitters, cap and trade, or whether it's further downstream, closer to looking like a consumption tax. So we understand the importance of a good market functioning cannot be minimized. And, price discovery is the most efficient way of leading to decarbonizing. We're going to have to deal with the loss of efficiency or deterioration with other taxes. So I think we need to recognize that tweaking or reforming some of the architecture to maintain flexibility on both sides of the demand and supply initiatives. So I have another question for the 3 of you. one of the comments raised by in the previous session is that markets require a certain size to be effective. And we've seen this in the EU, China, Korea. Malaysia would probably have some challenges as a market. So would you recommend going it alone as the UK has done? Or should we consider linking up with neighboring countries? What are your thoughts on this?
Thanks, Sunita, for the question. I agree also with the views of the experts that we've had in the last three sessions when they talk about the fact that you do need that critical mass, not only to have a vibrant market and for price discovery, but to actually have some entities that will actually take the plunge and move ahead and make the kinds of investments preemptively to be sure that they end up on the side of the cap, on the correct side of the cap, and have things to trade. While I'm at it, if you're thinking about a cap and tax, then that's essentially where you're setting the threshold for the tax to come in. So when you talk about a tax and cap, a cap and tax, it actually is a tax mechanism. Unless you allow some kind of trading, somehow within the flexibility of where you place that cap. So there are numerous combinations that you can have. You can even have, like you said, a hybrid. But I really do believe that Malaysia should begin engaging with ASEAN member states, particularly the ones closest to us who are already talking about implementing a tax, specifically Singapore and Indonesia. Thailand also very, very strong in terms of their voluntary market. But I think that at some point in time, as an economic and regional economic cooperation unit, we need to start talking about a window wherein at the start of that window, we can begin adding ASEAN member states into a cap and trade scheme that will ultimately, as the window progresses, add more and more until we have all members in ASEAN. Thank you.
Absolutely. So Darshan, you had gone through each of the ASEAN member states, well, most of them anyway. What are your thoughts on this? Unmute yourself. Thank you.
Yeah, so eventually, because of the global nature of climate change, at some point, we will need a uniform carbon pricing instrument framework that equalizes the price of carbon across all countries, to equalize incentives to decarbonize all across countries, and address things like leakage, for example. But we have to start somewhere, and the country level approach has the advantage of allowing countries to design and tailor their carbon pricing instruments to their domestic context, taking into account the varying socio-economic context or broader economic context of each country. And carbon pricing, as I mentioned just now, is always going to be a shock to the system because it's a new policy, it's a new way of doing business. And through carbon pricing, we always need to remember we're not trying to eradicate the use of fossil fuels. We're striving to achieve a balance between fossil fuel-driven economic growth and fossil fuel-driven environmental degradation. So this country-specific or gradualist approach towards CPI implementation can help in this way. Eventually, though, we will have no escape from the need to equalize prices, to equalize coverage, for example, within policy instruments, and to equalize these decarbonization incentives. This process, by the way, has already begun with the EU's carbon border adjustment mechanism, which is one way of equalizing incentives to decarbonize across jurisdictions. CBAM, however, is just the tip of the iceberg, because as more countries implement their own domestic carbon pricing instruments, they're going to want to address, the unfair competition that their trade exposed industries might face from other jurisdictions that don't have carbon prices in place. It's also being used to address leakage and to export climate ambition across countries. So eventually, I think this is a direction that we have to trend towards, and ASEAN coming together to come up with a unified singular framework would be great for the bloc as a whole. But until we get to that point, which may be 5 to 10 years away, we should all strive to get accustomed to functioning with a carbon price in place and internalizing the negative externality costs.
Thank you. Thank you, Darshan. Alizan, what are your thoughts on this?
Thank you for the question. Well, let me start by saying Malaysia is a trading nation. And because of this, as Darshan was saying, CBAM and potentially other mechanisms, Japan, Canada is being spoken about, will likely be influential for our own industry's carbon prices in reality. So this is something that there is a risk if we have a domestic emissions trading scheme that our carbon price is lower than what is actually needed by the market itself. Of course, this is not across all sectors, but this will be a major challenge, especially in specific sectors that are affected moving forward. And of course, from economic theory point of view, ultimately, the need to address climate change is a global issue, and therefore there needs to be a uniform pricing, as Darshan highlighted. But of course, the challenge here is more at the political level, political feasibility level, and also administratively as well. And here I do agree with both Darshan and Dr. Gary. I think realistically, gradually, it will have to begin in Malaysia. But we really do, in the long term, have to look at this from a regional perspective. We have the advantage of being within ASEAN. There's a lot of talk, of course, and objective of ASEAN economic integration. And the carbon market is a perfect place to as a showcase for ASEAN economic integration. And also, it makes sense as well because of the size of the market and so on. But again, I think there'll be many challenges, and I'll just bring one challenge there is, for example, when you talk about emissions trading, if you bring in forestry, how does that affect, for example, if we have within the compliance market, Malaysia trading our forest carbon credits, how does that affect our commitments to UNFCCC? So there are many details that we have to figure out before agreeing to that, but ultimately it makes sense to have a larger market.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Alizan. I am going to slip in another question because I see that all of you have been really diligent in responding to our Q&A box. And a lot of questions have been pretty much replied, and I think I can rely on you to reply on the rest. So before I ask you to give your closing remarks, I wanted to ask one question leading on to what Darshan had said. You know that carbon is global. You're going to need to avoid arbitrage, opportunistic behavior. We're going to need it to be equalized across all countries, right? And CBAM, either the country that's imposing CBAM is going to be affecting us, or we're going to get ahead of this. So we need to start this conversation sooner rather than later. We don't also want to be competing on the quality of credits in different countries. Financial regulations are going to be at different levels. We want the rules to be clear and predictable, and we need emissions to be decreasing rapidly this decade. So the end goal needs to be very clear. How are we going to juggle all of this? Your views, please. Simple question.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think that if you compare Malaysia to many countries, what you'll find is that many countries have made far stronger claims than Malaysia has, based on much weaker national circumstances. Malaysia is gifted in terms of the sunshine, amount of moisture that we have, its ability to practically grow things year round. And so I really strongly believe that rather than simply always being compelled to accept methodologies, guidance, and standards from international bodies, that Malaysia has enough of technocratic population that is capable of actually coming up with and justifying to a very high level the kinds of mechanisms, the kinds of products, and the kinds of instruments that actually constitute a very sustainable kind of development. And whether it's generation of renewable energy credits, whether it's generation of offsets, I think that there are many industries in Malaysia and sub-industries, subsectors that in essence mimic nature, reduce wastage, and essentially capture the full range of byproducts. It's better in some areas than others. I still see large amounts of metal when I ride my bicycle along the highways and roads. I mean, in other countries, you would not see that. The metal is so valuable, it would be picked up immediately. But you don't, for example, see large amounts of useful biomass lying around. Many times from our plantation sectors, all of this is used up either domestically or internationally. And the reason why it is because it's a low emission, low carbon source of fuel. And so once again, if we apply this then to all the other subsectors, what you'll find is that Malaysians should not be shy about the level of resource recovery that we do. And in fact, when we compare ourselves with the rest of the world, we should actually put all this information out there, because every resource, every unit of recovered resource actually means that much more emissions reductions.
I love that idea.
Yeah,
I love
thanks.
that idea. Thank you so much, Gary. Love that. Darshan, how are you going to top that?
I can't. But I will say that while the first best global policy response to climate change would be a uniform carbon price to equalize incentives, remove the opportunity for arbitrage, and so forth, whether this is feasible or not is a completely different question. And we're unlikely to see a situation where countries like Malaysia or one of the Pacific Island countries are going to agree to pay the same price of carbon as the United States, who are, for example, are responsible for a far greater share of the carbon that is currently in the atmosphere. So, and another thing, sorry, Sunita, I think you're on mute.
Sorry to interrupt you, but one of the questions that we're getting is also CBDR, not just between countries, but also within industries and then within sizes of businesses, right? And micro SMEs, sorry.
Just to add to the complexity of an already complex question. Yeah, so in this regard, we're unlikely to see, let's say, a uniform approach given a common but differentiated responsibilities across countries, across industries. But what Malaysia could do is develop a very broad understanding of what the expected climate damages are going to be over time, which industries, which sectors, which economic activities are going to be most affected. And for instance, designing its carbon pricing instruments in a way that allows us to then self-sustain funding towards addressing these consequences that we can't avoid. Malaysia contributes about 0.5% of global GDP. So us alone, we're not going to address the climate change mitigation challenge. It comes down to what we can do to best prepare ourselves for certain things that are inevitable. And I think I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Alizan.
Well, I can't top either of them, but I'll give a view from a policy perspective, once again, to emphasize what I said before. I think the key thing, first and foremost, is to have a clear and certain policy direction in achieving or in formulating and designing these carbon pricing instruments in the context of Malaysia. So first and foremost, kind of another way to answer this, I think we can't run away from an absolute emissions reduction target, both at a general level and at a sectoral level. If we have that, then it's moving backwards. So the CPI can be designed to achieve this specific quantitative target. And I do here believe, and I agree with Dr. Gary, that then we have very capable, we have a very capable financial institution, we have a very capable oil and gas industry, we have a very capable energy power sector, and so on. And there will be ingenuity to to achieve those targets, and also offer some of the products and services within the financial services as well to achieve a certain target. So it's not for me to specify what those products and services and strategies are, but first and foremost, we need that very clear target of what is it that, what is the emissions target that we are aiming for. And from there, working backwards, I think the industry is very capable to find the solutions to address that challenge.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. So finally, let's wrap this up. What are the closing remarks from each of you? For example, if you had the Prime Minister in the room, what would you want him to do?
I believe that you really should empower all the stakeholders, not just the ministries and agencies, research institutes, etc., but also empower the private sector associations, non-government organizations, civil society, to actually have these kinds of dialogues, because when just one of the examples, the questions was mooted regarding small and medium enterprises and how they might be able to play a role. We know how we can hybridize many of these things. Maybe it's something that may involve the carbon cost at the lowest and the smallest scales, which can be coupled with some kind of adaptation support or some kind of resilience strengthening. There are many combinations. There's a lot of talent out there in Malaysia and a lot of people with lots of good ideas, and really all they need is the right platform on which to bring these ideas so that the decision makers, the policy makers, can actually look at the numbers and the pros and cons and weigh these things, and then actually forge a national strategy that does not have to be modeled after countries that are very different from us, in terms of the strengths, weaknesses, their lifestyle. We're not wedded to any of those things. We can find uniquely Malaysian solutions to many of these problems.
I completely agree with you. It's what I've been saying for such a long time. Let's look for hyper-localized solutions that work for us. Thank you, Gary. Darshan?
Again, very difficult to top, but I'll just talk a bit on three things: awareness, information, and flexibility. So just to give you an example, last year there was an IPCC report that was published, I think the mitigation report, that said we need to now peak global emissions by 2025 at the latest. But it's been in vogue over the last 5 to 10 years to declare net zero targets by 2050. So where does that leave us, for example? And this is where, we need to maintain a level of flexibility in our responses to climate change, because a lot is still unknown and climate science is always rapidly evolving. Even in Malaysia, we look through the market failures just now, where there's incomplete information and, for example, in valuations of environmental goods. So we really need to embark on a drive to establish all these economic valuations, allow us to price goods properly, and from there we can respond quickly to new information, new stimulus to allow us to best address climate change.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you so much, Darshan. Alizan, what are your thoughts?
Well, climate change is an existential challenge. And I think first and foremost, if I had an audience with the Prime Minister, I think it has to be a priority. Again, through some of the research that we've undertaken before, often when we talk about environmental objectives, they are seen vis-a-vis or less priority than an economic objective. So first and foremost, we have to just set that this is a priority, and then we'll find the solutions to achieve them. As I mentioned, industry we can rely on the innovation and innovativeness of the industry, but also in terms of policy design as well. There are ways, for example, where I briefly highlighted, where if there is a carbon pricing instrument, it can be redistributed back into the most exposed sectors. It can be redistributed to vulnerable communities, such as the B40. But there needs to be the next step in, first of all, accepting that it is a priority, and then the design can come in, and we can have a national conversation on how to reduce this burden in a model of just transition.
Brilliant. You guys have been fabulous. Thank you, thank you, thank you so much. I can't stress enough the sense of urgency. I just want to pick up on what was said earlier, that we look to net zero 2050 because we want to keep limit warming to 2 degrees and keep pathways to 1.5 degrees open. But we know we are going to hit 1.5 degrees of warming now. So I think these targets need to be much more aggressive, treated much more urgently. And I think this conversation, this series of webinars that we've just capping off now is a really important contribution to that body of literature. So I can't thank you enough. I will be circling around to you definitely sometime in the near future to help move this conversation forward. But in the meantime, thank you so much. And thanks so much to our audience for joining us this evening. Bye, everyone.